What happens when orcs find a dreadnought that's been asleep for 15,000 years? In the grim darkness of the far future, there are tombs that should never be opened. Relics of wars so ancient that their very purpose has been forgotten by all but the most learned scholars. And yet, in a galaxy where brutality reigns supreme and curiosity knows no bounds, even the most sacred resting places can become battlegrounds once more. Today, we're exploring one of the most devastating encounters imaginable in Warhammer 40,000. What happens when a warband of orcs stumbles upon a space marine dreadnought that has been sleeping in stasis for 15,000 years? This isn't just a story about technology meeting brutality. It's a tale that touches upon the very heart of what makes the Warhammer 40,000 universe so compelling. The tragedy of warriors who cannot die, the relentless pragmatism of the orcs, and the slow erosion of everything that once had meaning in a galaxy that has forgotten mercy. To understand what happens when these two forces collide, we need to first understand what each represents. Picture this scene: a dead world on the fringes of Imperial space, its surface scarred by bombardment from conflicts so old that the very factions involved have long since ceased to exist. The air is thin and toxic, breathable only through filters or enhanced biology. Across its surface, the remnants of a fortress monastery lie in ruins, its proud walls collapsed into rubble, its sacred halls exposed to the elements. This place was once home to a chapter of the Adeptus Astartes, though which chapter and which war brought them to this forgotten rock has been lost to the passage of millennia. Deep within the ruins, beneath layers of collapsed stone and twisted metal, something waits. A chamber that was once a sacred vault, a place where the chapter's honored ancients were laid to rest between battles. The stasis pods within have long since failed, their power sources exhausted or damaged by the cataclysm that destroyed this place. All except one. One pod, buried deepest in the rubble, protected by layers of armored stone and ceramite, still maintains its function. Its power cell, a marvel of Dark Age technology that was already ancient when it was installed, continues to hum with barely perceptible energy. Within this pod, a consciousness waits in darkness, neither fully alive nor truly dead, existing in a state of suspension that has lasted for 150 centuries. Enter the Orks. Not the galaxy-conquering hordes of legend, but a relatively modest warband, perhaps 2,000 strong, led by a war boss, whose name translates roughly to Grot Masha. They arrived in this system following the psychic pull of the War, that peculiar gestalt field that draws orcs toward conflict like moths to a flame. The system appeared dead on first inspection, but something about this world called to them. Perhaps it was the lingering psychic resonance of ancient battles, or maybe just the orcish instinct for finding good scrap. Whatever the reason, Grot Masha decided this place was worth investigating. The orcs made planetfall in their typical fashion, which is to say, with absolutely no regard for safety, structural integrity, or aerodynamic principles. Their ramshackle transports screamed through the atmosphere, trailing smoke and occasionally bits of themselves, before slamming into the planet's surface with impacts that would have killed any less resilient species. The boys emerged from the wreckage laughing and already arguing about who had the best landing, which in orc terms meant who crashed the hardest without actually dying. Grot Masha, a particularly large specimen even by orc standards, stood amid the ruins and surveyed his new domain. He was accompanied by his retinue of nobs, as well as several mech boys, who had already begun poking through the rubble with the single-minded focus that characterizes their kind. To the mech boys, this place was paradise. Everywhere they looked, they saw technology. Not orc technology, which they understood instinctively, but the sophisticated, elegant, and thoroughly impractical machinery of the Adeptus Astartes. To the mech boys, such technology represented both a puzzle and an opportunity. They might not understand why the Humies built things the way they did, but they knew good metal when they saw it. Among the mech boys was one particularly cunning specimen, who the other Orks called Sparkgit, a name earned through his habit of accidentally electrocuting himself during his experiments. Sparkgit had a gift, even by mech boy standards. Where other mechs saw scrap to be repurposed, Sparkgit saw the ghost of function, the echo of purpose that lingered in ancient machinery. He wandered through the ruins with an almost reverent attention, his optical implants whirring and clicking as they analyzed the wreckage around him. It was Sparkgit who first detected the energy signature. It was faint, barely registering on the crude aurspex he carried, but it was there, a power source, still active after all this time. He followed the signal deeper into the ruins, gesturing for a mob of Gretchen to accompany him and start digging. The Gretchen, those long-suffering smaller cousins of the Orks, set to work with typical enthusiasm, motivated by equal parts fear of Sparkgit's wrench and excitement at the possibility of finding something shiny. They dug for hours, shifting rubble and cutting through twisted metal. The power signature grew stronger as they descended, and Sparkgit's excitement mounted with it. Whatever was down there was big, and it was still running. The other mech boys noticed his activity and came to investigate, bringing with them more Gretchen and some of the larger Orks who could shift the heavier debris. Soon, a substantial portion of the warband was involved in the excavation, all of them eager to see what treasure Sparkgit had found. The breakthrough came as the sun began to set on the ruined world. A Gretchen's pick broke through into empty space, and air rushed into the chamber they had uncovered. It was stale, having been sealed for millennia, but the systems within had kept it from becoming completely toxic. Sparkgit widened the hole and dropped into the chamber, landing with a metallic clang on the floor below. His optical implants adjusted to the darkness, and what they revealed made even his Orky heart beat faster. The chamber was intact, completely, impossibly intact. While the fortress above had been reduced to rubble, this vault had survived, protected by force fields and structural reinforcement that had outlasted the civilization that built them. And in the center of the chamber, surrounded by the remains of other stasis pods that had long since failed, stood a single functioning unit. Within it, barely visible through layers of frost and ancient energies, was the silhouette of a dreadnought. Now, to understand what Sparkgit was looking at, we need to take a moment to discuss what a dreadnought actually is, and more importantly, what it means to become one. In the grim calculus of the Adeptus Astartes, death is not the end of service. When a space marine suffers wounds so catastrophic that even their enhanced biology and the skills of their apothecaries cannot save them, they are offered a choice. Not that it's much of a choice, really. They can die, their gene seed harvested to create the next generation of warriors, their name added to the rolls of honor, their sacrifice remembered, or they can continue to serve. And to continue serving in such a state requires becoming something that is neither fully alive nor entirely machine. The Dreadnought is a walking tomb, a sophisticated life support system encased in armored ceramite and adamantium, bristling with weapons that would be impossible for a normal human to wield. The mortally wounded warrior is sealed within a sarcophagus at the machine's heart, their ruined body suspended in amniotic fluid, their nervous system hardwired into the Dreadnought's controls. What remains of their organic brain becomes the machine's processor, their consciousness, the guiding intelligence that directs tons of armored might across the battlefield. The process of creating a Dreadnought is both a sacred ritual and a brutal necessity. The wounded warrior is brought to the chapter's fortress monastery, to chambers deep within where the tech marines maintain their most precious artifacts. There, in operating theaters that blend the sterile precision of medical facilities with the incense-thick atmosphere of shrines, the transformation begins. Apothecaries and tech marines work in concert, their movements coordinated through decades of practice, their prayers to the machine god and the emperor flowing together in a liturgy of flesh and steel. First, the warrior's body, must be stabilized. This is no simple task when dealing with injuries severe enough to necessitate Dreadnought internment. We're talking about wounds that would kill a normal human instantly and would send even an unenhanced space marine into immediate cardiac arrest. Limbs severed, organs crushed, spines shattered, skulls fractured. The list of potential injuries is as varied as it is horrific. The apothecaries work with desperate speed, replacing blood, stabilizing vital signs, using the most advanced medical technology the Imperium possesses to keep the spark of life burning just a little longer. Simultaneously, the Tech Marines prepare the sarcophagus. Each one is a masterwork of engineering, built to house a specific warrior, customized to their injuries and their physiology. The internal mechanisms must be precisely calibrated. The neural interface is aligned to match the warrior's nervous system. The life support systems tuned to their specific biochemistry. The sensory feeds configured to translate machine input into something a human brain can process. This is not mass production. This is bespoke craftsmanship of the highest order. Each dreadnought as unique as the warrior it will contain. When both warrior and machine are ready, the transfer begins. This is the moment that will define the rest of the warrior's existence, however long that existence might be. The Tech Marines begin the neural interface procedure, threading impossibly thin wires into the warrior's brain, each one carrying both sensory data and control signals. These wires must be placed with microscopic precision. Too shallow and they won't function, too deep and they'll cause irreversible brain damage. The warrior remains conscious through much of this, their enhanced physiology and the ceremonial importance of the moment requiring them to witness their own transformation. The sensations are described by those who have undergone the process as indescribable and yet unforgettable. There's the cold of the neural probes entering the brain, a chill that seems to freeze thought itself. There's the sudden rush of alien sensations as the Dreadnought's sensors come online, overwhelming the warrior's organic senses with input their brain was never designed to process. There's the horror of feeling your body being sealed away, entombed in amniotic fluid, cut off from all normal sensation. And there's the strange, vertiginous moment when you realize that you can feel the Dreadnought's limbs as if they were your own, can sense the hum of its reactor as a heartbeat, can perceive the world through optical sensors that see in spectrums human eyes were never meant to detect. The warrior's organic body, what's left of it, is carefully positioned within the sarcophagus. The amniotic fluid serves multiple purposes. It provides nutrients and oxygen, removes waste products, maintains the precise temperature and chemical balance necessary for human tissue to survive, and acts as a cushion against the tremendous forces the Dreadnought will experience in battle. The warrior floats in this fluid, weightless, all their remaining limbs secured so they can't interfere with the Dreadnought's operation. They will never walk again, never use their hands, never breathe air or feel the touch of another person. Everything they experience from this moment forward will be mediated through the machine. The psychological impact of this transformation cannot be overstated. Imagine for a moment what it would be like to have your entire sensory experience replaced. Every sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell you've ever known, gone, replaced by data feeds and sensor readouts. The feeling of your heart beating in your chest, replaced by the hum of a fusion reactor. The weight of your body, the sense of occupying space, replaced by the feedback from a machine that weighs several tons and stands 3 times your original height. Your hands, which you've used to grip weapons and embrace brothers and perform 1,000 daily tasks, replaced by weapon systems that can level buildings but can't pick up a single leaf without crushing it. Many newly interred dreadnoughts go through a period of what the Tech Marines clinically call adjustment difficulties, but which would more accurately be described as psychological breakdown. They rage against their confinement, trying desperately to reach for things with hands they no longer have, attempting to speak with mouths that have been replaced by Vox speakers, struggling to breathe when their lungs have been bypassed entirely by mechanical life support. Some never adjust, their minds fragmenting under the strain, becoming mad things that must be restrained or, in the worst cases, permanently deactivated. Those who do adjust, who manage to accept what they've become, face a different challenge: the slow erosion of their humanity. The neural interface that allows them to control the Dreadnought also changes how they think. The constant stream of tactical data, the weapon targeting calculations, the threat assessments, and defensive posture recommendations, all of this begins to crowd out more subtle thoughts. Emotions become harder to access. Memories grow distant and abstract. Personal connections fade like photographs left too long in the sun. This is why the chapters maintain the practice of putting dreadnoughts into stasis between battles. It's presented as a mercy, a way to preserve the pilot's sanity, and there's truth to that. But it's also a practical necessity. A dreadnought kept active for too long becomes something else, something that retains the tactical knowledge and combat experience of the Space Marine they once were, but loses everything that made them a person. They become, essentially, very sophisticated combat servitors, guided by programming rather than will, operating on protocols rather than principles. The stasis itself is another layer of existential horror. It's not sleep, not really. There are no dreams in stasis, no processing of experiences or working through of emotions. It's simply nothing, a complete cessation of consciousness that could last for days or decades or centuries. When a dreadnought is awakened, they have no sense of how long they've been asleep. The moment of being put into stasis and the moment of awakening feel contiguous, as if no time has passed at all. But then they look around and see unfamiliar faces, hear reports of battles they don't remember, realize that the world has moved on without them. This temporal displacement compounds over time. After a few awakenings, a dreadnought might notice that the young warriors they remember have become veterans. After a few more, those veterans are chapter masters or dead. After enough awakenings, everyone they knew is gone. The chapter's traditions have evolved. The very language has shifted subtly in pronunciation and vocabulary. They become strangers in their own home, ancient relics who remember a chapter that no longer exists, who served alongside heroes who have become myths, who fought in wars that have been forgotten, except as footnotes in the chapter's most ancient records. It sounds like an honor, and the chapters of the Adeptus Astartes treat it as such. To be chosen for internment in a dreadnought is to be deemed worthy of eternal service, to have your experience and wisdom preserved for the benefit of future generations. The ceremonies surrounding the process are solemn and sacred. The Tech Marines who perform the operation treat it as the most holy of their duties, and the newly interred warrior is given a place of reverence within the chapter's halls. But here's the truth that the ceremonies and the reverence try to hide. Being a dreadnought is a curse. It is a prison of metal and ceramite from which there is no escape, no parole, and no hope of release, except through destruction so complete that even the sacred sarcophagus cannot be salvaged. The pilot feels nothing except what the machine's sensors tell them. They cannot taste, cannot smell, cannot feel the touch of another being or the warmth of sunlight on their skin. Every sensation is filtered through layers of technology, translated into data, and fed into a brain that was never meant to process information in this way. Worse still is the isolation. The extended neural interface required to control a dreadnought places immense stress on the pilot's consciousness. They begin to suffer from confusion, lethargy, and a disturbing disconnect from the passage of time. A day can feel like a year, or a decade can pass in what seems like moments. To preserve what remains of their sanity, the Tech Marines seal the pilots in stasis between battles, allowing them to sleep away the centuries in a void of unconsciousness. But stasis is not true sleep. It is not rest in any meaningful sense. It is simply a suspension of consciousness, a forced hibernation that feels like nothing at all. When the dreadnought is awakened, it is as if no time has passed, as if the moment of sleep and the moment of waking are one and the same. Yet, at the same time, the pilot knows that time has passed, can feel its weight in the gaps in their memory, in the unfamiliar faces of the battle brothers who greet them, in the subtle changes to technology and doctrine that mark the passage of years. And the longer a dreadnought sleeps, the worse it becomes. Memories fade, not all at once but gradually, like sand slipping through fingers. First to go are the small personal moments, the individual faces of fallen comrades, the sound of a particular voice, the feeling of walking into the chapter's great hall. Then larger memories begin to erode, entire campaigns reduced to tactical data, the reasons for fighting forgotten, while the mechanics of violence remain perfectly preserved. Eventually, if the pilot survives long enough, they become something barely recognizable as the warrior they once were. A consciousness that exists only to fight, that remembers battles but not why they were fought, that knows the names of enemies but not the names of friends. The oldest known dreadnought in service to the Imperium is Bjorn the Fell-Handed of the Space Wolves, who has been entombed for over 10,000 years. Bjorn fought in the Great Crusade, stood beside the Primarch Leman Russ himself, and witnessed the Emperor before the Horus Heresy. He is awoken once each century so that the Space Wolves can hear his tales of those ancient times, to maintain their connection to their Primarch and their history. But even Bjorn, whose will is legendary and whose consciousness has somehow endured across the millennia, shows signs of the toll. He is irascible, bitter about his condition, and increasingly detached from the concerns of the present day. He pretends to be more senile than he is, hoping that his brothers will stop waking him to tell the same stories over and over again. Now imagine a dreadnought that has been asleep not for 10,000 years, but for 15,000. A warrior who was interred during the Age of Strife, before the Emperor unified terror, before the Great Crusade, before any of the events that shape the current Imperium even occurred. A pilot who went to sleep in one age of humanity and is about to wake in another so different that it might as well be a different species. Everything they knew, everyone they served with, every ideal they fought for, has been dead for longer than most civilizations have existed. This is what lay in that stasis pod that Sparkgit discovered. Not just a dreadnought, but an ancient beyond ancients, a relic of a war that predated the Imperium itself. The chapter that built this fortress, the brothers who served alongside this warrior, even the enemies they fought, all have been dead for so long that their very existence has become myth. The Imperium that this dreadnought knew, if the Imperium even existed in recognizable form when they were interred, bore no resemblance to the corrupt, dystopian theocracy that now spans the galaxy. The dreadnought itself was a masterwork, even to Sparkgit's untrained eye. It was of a pattern he had never seen before, more ancient even than the Contemptor class that sometimes appeared in the arsenals of the oldest Space Marine chapters. The armor was smooth and elegant in a way that spoke of technologies long since lost, the weapons integrated into the chassis with a sophistication that made even Ork-modified Def Dreads look crude by comparison. This was technology from an age when humanity's understanding of science bordered on the miraculous, when the construction of such a machine was not an act of reverent duplication, but of genuine innovation. Sparkgit moved closer, his mechanical eye whirring as it focused on the control panels that adorned the stasis pod. The displays were dark, running on emergency power only, but they still functioned. He could see readouts in a language he couldn't read, displaying information he couldn't interpret. But the mech boy's instincts told him what mattered. This thing still worked. The pilot was still viable, the system still functional. After 15,000 years of sleep, this ancient warrior could be awakened. The question was, should he? Sparkgit wrestled with this dilemma for approximately 3 seconds before deciding that yes, obviously they should wake it up, because the only thing better than finding a huge stompy robot is making a huge stompy robot work again. To understand why this was such an obvious choice to Sparkgit, we need to take a moment to discuss the Ork relationship with technology. It's fundamentally different from how humanity, or indeed any other species in the galaxy, approaches the creation and use of machines. Where humans rely on accumulated knowledge, careful engineering, and strict adherence to established principles, orcs operate on a combination of instinct, experimentation, and what can only be described as psychic wish fulfillment. You see, orcs are not a natural species. They were created, engineered by an ancient race called the Old Ones during a conflict so far back in galactic history that the details have been lost to time. The Old Ones needed warriors, soldiers who could be deployed anywhere, who would fight with reckless abandon, and who would multiply rapidly to replace losses. What they created were the Krork, massive warrior organisms that combined biological and technological sophistication in ways that seem impossible by modern standards. The modern orcs are the degraded descendants of those ancient Krork. They're smaller, cruder, less sophisticated in both biology and technology, but they retain one crucial feature that their creators built into them: genetically encoded knowledge. An orc mech boy doesn't learn to build engines or guns through education or training. They know how to do it instinctively, the knowledge bubbling up from their genetic memory as they mature. It's as natural to them as breathing is to humans. This genetic knowledge is both incredibly sophisticated and frustratingly incomplete. A mech boy can look at a pile of scrap metal and instinctively understand how to turn it into a functioning weapon or vehicle. They know which pieces should connect to which, where to apply pressure, how to create moving parts from seemingly incompatible components. But they don't understand why any of it works. They can't explain the principles involved, can't design something new from scratch based on theoretical knowledge. They're incredible engineers operating purely on instinct. This is where the orc gestalt psychic field comes in. Orcs generate a subtle psychic effect simply by existing, and this effect becomes stronger when orcs gather in large groups. This field has many manifestations. It's what makes red vehicles go faster and purple ones harder to see. What makes a gun shoot straighter if an orc believes it will. What makes improbable contraptions continue functioning despite violating multiple laws of physics. The relationship between mech boy instinct and the psychic field creates a strange feedback loop. A mech boy builds a gun that shouldn't work based on human engineering principles. Maybe the barrel isn't rifled properly. Maybe the firing mechanism is missing critical components. Maybe the whole thing is held together with bolts that are the wrong size. But the mech boy believes it will work, because their genetic knowledge tells them it will, and because enough orcs believe it will work. Because the psychic field reinforces that belief. It does work. Not reliably, not safely, but it works. This makes orc technology simultaneously crude and sophisticated. It's crude in execution. Rough welds, mismatched parts, components that barely fit together. But it's sophisticated in effect. Weapons that hit harder than their size suggests. Vehicles that move faster than their engines should allow. Force fields that operate on principles the mechanicus would kill to understand. An Imperial guardsman trying to use an orc weapon would find it jams constantly or explodes in their hands. But in an orc's hands, that same weapon functions perfectly because the orc's psychic field fills in the gaps where proper engineering should be. This brings us to looting, which is less a tactic for orcs and more a way of life. When orcs encounter technology from other races, they don't just steal it, they appropriate it, modify it, make it orky. A looted Imperial tank doesn't just get a coat of red paint and some spiky bits. It gets its entire operational philosophy changed. The careful fire control systems are ripped out and replaced with something that shoots more bullets, but less accurately. The armor is reinforced in random places, making it heavier but no more effective. Extra weapons are bolted on wherever there's space, regardless of whether the targeting systems can handle them. And yet, these looted vehicles work. A mech boy can take an Imperial Lehman Russ tank, modify it in ways that should render it completely non-functional, and create a machine that somehow performs better than the original, at least by orc standards. The tank won't be more accurate or reliable, but it'll be louder, faster, and carry more guns. To the mech boy, These are clear improvements. The process of looting is both destructive and creative. The mech boy starts by tearing apart whatever they've captured, examining how it works with that instinctive understanding that's coded into their genes. They don't recognize sophisticated components as sophisticated. They see them as fancy bits that might be useful or might just be taking up space where more weapons could go. A precision-engineered servo system gets evaluated purely on whether it makes things move, not on how smoothly or accurately it moves them. Then comes the modification phase. This is where the mech boys' creativity really shines. They start adding things, armor plates scavenged from somewhere else, weapons that have no business being mounted on this type of vehicle, mechanical systems that serve no obvious purpose but looked impressive to the mech boy. They paint it, usually red because red makes things go faster, with perhaps some yellow or black for contrast. They add spikes and tusks and skull motifs because orcs believe that scary-looking things are more effective in combat. Throughout this process, other orcs offer suggestions, usually by hitting the mech boy and yelling about what they think should be added. This collaborative approach means that most looted vehicles end up as bizarre compromises between multiple orcs' ideas of what makes a proper war machine. The result is something that looks like it was assembled by a committee of violent lunatics working without blueprints, because that's exactly what it is. But here's the remarkable thing. It works. Not just sort of works, not just barely functions, but genuinely works as a combat vehicle. The looted tank tears across battlefields, its hodgepodge engine somehow keeping pace with purpose-built racing vehicles. Its weapons fire with devastating effect, despite the fact that half the targeting systems have been replaced with painted-on gun sights. Its armor, reinforced in seemingly random places, somehow manages to deflect shots that should penetrate. The orc psychic field makes up for every engineering shortcoming, fills every gap in the design with sheer belief. Now apply this orc philosophy of technology to a space marine dreadnought. From a human perspective, a dreadnought is a sacred war machine, a repository of ancient knowledge and honored tradition, a technology so sophisticated that the Imperium can barely maintain it, let alone reproduce it. But from an orc mech boy's perspective, a dreadnought is just a really impressive stompy robot. It's bigger than a killer can, more sophisticated than a death dread, covered in weapons and armor and interesting bits that might be useful elsewhere. Sparkgit didn't see a fallen hero of the Adeptus Astartes when he looked at that stasis pod. He saw the best loot he'd ever found. He saw a machine that, if he could figure out how to make it work, would make him the most respected mech boy in the warband. He saw components he could study, designs he could copy, technologies he could appropriate and orcify. The fact that there was a living being inside the machine, that the dreadnought was as much tomb as vehicle, simply didn't register as important. This fundamental difference in perspective would shape every interaction that followed. The pilot of the dreadnought was about to discover that not only had they awakened 15,000 years in the future, but they were being treated not as a warrior or even a person, but as a particularly interesting piece of salvage. For an entity whose entire existence had been defined by service and duty, by the respect accorded to an honored ancient, this reduction to mere technology would be more disturbing than even the passage of millennia. Sparkgit's enthusiasm was infectious in the way that orc enthusiasm usually is, loud, physical, and impossible to ignore. As he began poking at the stasis pod's controls, other mech boys crowded around, each one offering their own theories about how to wake up the Humi machine. Their discussion took the form of what could charitably be called aggressive collaboration. One mech boy would suggest pressing a particular button, another would bash him aside to pull a different lever, a third would hit them both to establish dominance before trying something entirely different. It was engineering by combat, guided more by confidence than competence. The notion that there might be consequences to awakening something that had been deliberately sealed away never crossed his mind, because orcs don't really do consequences. They do action, reaction, and more action. Planning for the future is something that happens in the brief moment between deciding to do something and actually doing it. He began examining the controls, trying to puzzle out their function. Other mech boys joined him, and soon there were half a dozen of them clustered around the pod, arguing in the peculiar mixture of violence and cooperation that characterizes Ork technical discussion. One would suggest pressing a particular button, another would bash him for being stupid and press a different button, a third would hit them both and start pulling on a lever. It was engineering by aggressive consensus, guided more by instinct and the peculiar psychic field that makes Ork technology function than by any actual understanding of what they were doing. The Gretchen, meanwhile, had been busy. They had cleared away more rubble, uncovered more of the chamber, and discovered something that made their greedy little hearts sing. Weapons. The vault had been more than just a resting place for the Dreadnought. It had been an armory. Stored in mag-locked alcoves around the chamber's perimeter were bolters, power weapons, suits of ancient armor, and ammunition that had been kept in perfect stasis for millennia. To the Gretchen, this was treasure beyond measure. To Grotmasha, who had descended into the chamber to see what all the fuss was about, it was confirmation that this place was worth the visit. But the real prize was the Dreadnought, and the mech boys were making progress. They had figured out how to interface with the pod's systems, after a fashion. SparkGit had bypassed several safety protocols that he didn't understand by the simple expedient of ripping out the relevant components, and he had managed to redirect power from the chamber's still-functioning generator to the awakening sequence. Warning lights that had not illuminated in 15 millennia began to blink. Emergency klaxons that had been silent for longer than recorded history began to wail, and deep within the pod, systems began to activate. The first thing the systems did was assess the condition of the pilot. Medical scanners that predated the Imperium ran diagnostic checks on flesh that had not drawn breath in 15,000 years. They found damage, extensive damage, injuries that would have killed any normal human a dozen times over. But they also found life, or at least the potential for life. The tissue was viable, the brain functions could be restored, the nervous system could be reactivated. The systems began their work, flooding the sarcophagus with stimulants and neural activators, jump-starting a metabolism that had been dormant for longer than civilizations. Deep within that metal tomb, a consciousness began to stir. It was not a smooth awakening, not the gentle transition from sleep to wakefulness that characterizes natural rest. It was violent, abrupt, a yanking back into existence from a void that had felt eternal. Sensation flooded a mind that had known nothing for 15,000 years. Pain came first, bright and sharp, as nerves that had been silent for millennia suddenly screamed with input. Then came confusion, a desperate attempt to understand where and when and who and why. The pilot's last memories were of the battle, always the battle. There had been an enemy, something with claws and too many limbs, something that had broken through their defenses and gotten close enough to strike. They remembered the pain of their armor being breached, the feeling of their body being crushed and torn, the desperation of holding the line even as their twin hearts failed and their blood mixed with the dirt of whatever world they had been fighting for. They remembered their brothers gathering around them, remembered the apothecary's grim assessment, remembered the choice that wasn't really a choice at all. And they remembered the transition, the cold operating table, the whir of medical servitors, the quiet chanting of the tech marines as they performed the sacred rites, the moment when the last of their biological body was severed from the world and sealed within the sarcophagus, the first time they opened their new eyes and saw the world through optical senses instead of flesh. The horror and the wonder of it, the feeling of being simultaneously more and less than they had been before. But that had been how long ago? The chrono display in their consciousness tried to provide an answer, but the numbers made no sense. They must be corrupted, damaged by whatever had happened to put them in this state. The last thing they clearly remembered was being put into stasis after their third deployment in the Dreadnought chassis. That should have been temporary, a brief rest between battles. They should have been awakened within weeks at most. The sensory data streaming into their consciousness told a different story. Their Dreadnought systems were running on backup power, the main reactor operating at barely 20% capacity. The stasis field that should have been maintained by the fortress's power grid was instead being sustained by the Dreadnought's own emergency reserves. This wasn't a planned awakening. This was an emergency reactivation, triggered by what? External interference? System failure? They tried to access the fortress's network, to query the tactical systems for status reports and deployment orders. Nothing. Either the connections had been severed, or there were no systems left to connect to. They attempted to broadcast on the chapter's standard communication frequencies, sending out identification codes and requesting acknowledgement. Static. Absolute crushing static across every channel. The panic that seized them in that moment was primal, overwhelming even the Dreadnought's emotional dampening systems. They were cut off, isolated, adrift in a way that transcended mere physical separation. Every link that had connected them to their chapter, every bond that had defined their existence as a space marine, was simply gone. Not blocked, not jammed, just absent, as if they had never existed at all. They forced their optical sensors to activate, fighting through warning indicators and system errors. The view that greeted them was wrong on every level. The stasis chamber was damaged, its walls cracked and stained with what looked like centuries of water seepage. The other stasis pods that should have been arranged around the room were dark, their power long since exhausted, their occupants either dead or transferred elsewhere. The sacred icons that should have adorned the walls were corroded beyond recognition or missing entirely. And standing in front of them, highlighted by the Dreadnought's targeting systems, were the Orks. The pilot's combat programming kicked in immediately, overlaying threat assessments and firing solutions across their vision. Multiple hostiles, well armed, distributed in a loose semicircle that suggested either tactical awareness or fortunate positioning. The largest one was clearly the leader, his massive frame and superior equipment marking him as the primary target. The smaller ones clustered around the stasis pod's controls were likely technical specialists, dangerous in their own way, but lower priority in a combat situation. But even as their weapon systems spun up, preparing to engage, another part of their consciousness was processing the implications of what they were seeing. These Orks shouldn't be here. The fortress's defenses should have been impregnable, its location a closely guarded secret. For Orks to have penetrated this deep, to have accessed the stasis chambers themselves, something catastrophic must have occurred. Not just a battle lost, but the complete collapse of the fortress's defensive network. The pilot's analytical subroutines began working through possibilities. Enemy bombardment. Possible, but orbital defenses should have prevented anything capable of breaching the fortress. Internal betrayal. Unlikely. The chapter's screening and indoctrination processes made traitors rare to the point of impossibility. Siege warfare. Perhaps, but any siege would have been mentioned in the strategic briefings before they were put into stasis. Unless they hadn't been in stasis for weeks. Unless the siege hadn't been mentioned because it happened after they went to sleep. Unless everything they knew about the current tactical situation was wildly out of date. The pilot pulled up their internal chronometer, comparing it to the stasis pod's logs. The comparison took several seconds, the corrupted data requiring multiple verification passes before the pilot could trust the results. When the calculation finally completed, the number that appeared in their consciousness was so large it seemed meaningless. Not weeks, not months, not even years or decades, millennia, multiple millennia. They tried to reject the data, to dismiss it as a corruption error or a malfunction. But the evidence was everywhere once they started looking for it. The advanced decay of the chamber, the complete absence of network connectivity, the fact that the stasis pod's emergency power reserves designed to last for centuries, had been exhausted and replenished and exhausted again multiple times based on the wear patterns on the cell housings. The linguistic drift evident in the Orks' speech. Gothic, yes, but corrupted and evolved in ways that suggested centuries of separation from any formal standard. 15,000 years. They had been asleep for 15,000 years. Everyone they had known was dead. Not recently dead, not killed in some battle they might have prevented, but dead for so long that their bones had turned to dust, and that dust had been scattered by winds that had since changed direction. The wars they had fought in were ancient history, studied by scholars if they were remembered at all. The ideals they had sworn to uphold had either evolved beyond recognition or been abandoned entirely. The weight of this realization was crushing. The Dreadnought's chassis groaned as the pilot's unconscious reaction caused their servos to lock up, their systems fluctuating wildly as their organic brains struggled to process information. It was never designed to handle. 15,000 years. The Age of Strife had lasted roughly 5,000 years. The Great Crusade had taken 200. The Horus Heresy had been over in less than a decade. But they had slept for 15,000 years, a span of time longer than the entire history of the Imperium, longer than the recorded history of most civilizations. What kind of galaxy had they awakened to? What had become of humanity in all that time? The empire that they remembered, if the empire had even existed in recognizable form when they were interred, would have risen and fallen multiple times over such a span. Technologies would have been lost and rediscovered. Cultures would have evolved past all recognition. The very geography of the galaxy might have changed. Stars dying, worlds being destroyed or terraformed, sectors being claimed and lost and reclaimed by forces the pilot couldn't even imagine. And what of their chapter? Even if it had survived, even if it still existed somewhere in this strange future, it would have changed beyond recognition. New heroes would have risen and fallen. New traditions would have replaced the old. New enemies would have emerged and been defeated or accommodated. The brothers who had placed them in this stasis pod were 15,000 years dead. The tech marines who had sworn to wake them when needed had failed in that duty, whether through death, forgetfulness, or the simple passage of too much time for any promise to remain meaningful. The pilot was alone, utterly, completely alone, in a way that transcended mere physical isolation. They were the last survivor of a dead age, a relic from a time so far removed from the present that it might as well have been myth. They were a ghost, an echo of something that had ceased to exist so long ago that even the memory of it had faded into obscurity. They had expected to wake to the faces of their brothers, to be told of the outcome of the battle they had fallen in, to receive their first assignment in this new form. What they got instead was this: confused voices speaking a language that sounded like Gothic, but with an accent so thick and corrupted that it was barely comprehensible. The feeling of rough hands on their chassis, the sensation of systems being activated in the wrong sequence, the warning indicators lighting up across their consciousness like a constellation of threats. Panic seized them. After 15,000 years of nothing, their first emotion was pure, primal fear. They tried to move and found their body responding, but wrong, too slowly, as if they were fighting through mud. They tried to speak and heard their voice emerge from the Dreadnought's Vox speakers as a grinding mechanical screech, completely unintelligible even to themselves. They tried to access their tactical displays and received only fragments of data, corrupted readouts that made no sense, references to systems and formations and protocols that their memory couldn't place. Outside the sarcophagus, the Orks were having a fantastic time. The ancient war machine was moving, jerking and spasming like a puppet whose strings were being randomly pulled. Lights flickered across its surface, weapon systems activated and deactivated at random, and the whole chassis emanated a sort of barely contained energy that Orks instinctively recognized as the prelude to violence. Sparkgit was practically dancing with excitement, his proclamations of "I fixed it, somewhat premature given that the Dreadnought was clearly having what could only be described as a mechanical seizure. Grotmasher, being a war boss of some experience, recognized that they had approximately 30 seconds before whatever was in that machine got itself sorted out and started killing everything in the room. He began bellowing orders, getting his boys into something resembling defensive positions, though with Orks, defensive positions are really just offensive positions that haven't started moving yet. The Gretchen, with their finely tuned survival instincts, were already scrambling for the exits, clutching whatever loot they had managed to grab. Inside the sarcophagus, the pilot was fighting their way toward consciousness with the same determination that had characterized their entire existence. They forced their systems to stabilize, overriding warnings and shutting down non-essential processes to focus on the basics: sensors, movement, weapons. The fog of confusion began to clear, replaced by the cold, analytical mindset that had been drilled into them through centuries of warfare. Assess the situation, identify threats, respond appropriately. The sensors began to provide useful data. They were in a chamber, underground based on the readings. There were multiple life forms present, large ones, armed and potentially hostile. The chamber itself was wrong. It should be familiar, should be the vault where they had been laid to rest, but the readings suggested massive structural damage, systems offline, power at barely 10% of what it should be. How long had they been asleep? The chrono display tried to provide an answer, but the numbers it showed made no sense. They must be corrupted, damaged by whatever had happened to the vault. They activated their external visual sensors, and for the first time in 15,000 years, looked upon the world. What they saw defied comprehension. The chamber was indeed damaged, barely recognizable as the sacred vault they remembered. And standing before them, illuminated by the glow of the Dreadnought's awakening systems, were Orks. Not the refined, organized Orks of ancient Imperial propaganda, if such propaganda had ever existed. These were the Orks of the 41st Millennium, the result of tens of thousands of years of genetic refinement through constant warfare. They were massive, far larger than the pilot remembered Orks being, clad in crude armor that somehow managed to be both ramshackle and functional. They carried weapons that looked like they had been assembled from scrap metal and spite, yet those weapons were very clearly operational and pointed in the Dreadnought's direction. The pilot's tactical systems identified the threat immediately. Multiple hostiles, well armed, positioned in a semicircle around the stasis pod. The largest one, clearly the leader, was shouting something in that corrupted Gothic, gesturing with a weapon that looked like someone had welded 3 different guns together and then hit the resulting mess with a hammer until it looked intimidating. The smaller ones, the mech boys, if the pilot's knowledge of Ork castes was still accurate, were clustered around the pod's control systems, still pressing buttons and pulling levers, with no apparent understanding of what they were doing. The analytical part of the pilot's mind, the part that had been preserved and enhanced by their transformation into a Dreadnought, began to piece together what had happened. They had been found. The vault had been breached. These Orks had somehow accessed the stasis pod and awakened them. But why? And more importantly, how long had they been asleep for this to be possible? The fortress should have been impregnable. The vault impossible to access without the proper authorization. For it to be in this state, for Orks to have penetrated this deep, something catastrophic must have occurred. They tried to access the fortress's systems, to pull up defensive readouts or status reports, but found nothing. Either the connections had been severed, or there were no systems left to connect to. They tried to reach out on the chapter's communication frequencies, broadcasting a standard identification and status report, but received only static in response. They attempted to query the tactical network for mission parameters, for deployment orders, for any kind of directive that would tell them what they were supposed to do, but the network didn't exist. The isolation of that moment was absolute. They were alone, truly alone, in a way that transcended mere physical separation. Every connection that had once linked them to their chapter, Every bond that had defined their existence as a space marine was simply gone. Severed not by betrayal or defeat, but by something far more inexorable: time. The Orks were getting impatient. Grotmasher was still shouting, his commands growing more insistent, though the pilot still couldn't fully understand what he was saying. The corrupted Gothic was too different, too degraded, though certain words came through. Shoot, fight, stompy, and what might have been, make it work proper-like. The Dreadnought's auto-targeting systems had locked onto the war boss, identifying him as the primary threat based on size, armament, and the way the other Orks deferred to him. A decision point crystallized in the pilot's consciousness. They could remain passive, try to communicate, attempt to understand this situation before acting, or they could do what they had been designed to do, what every instinct and training protocol was screaming at them to do: destroy the enemies of humanity. The Orks were Xenos, abominations, targets that existed only to be purged. The fact that they had somehow accessed this sacred vault, that they had their hands on holy technology, only made them more deserving of death. But something gave the pilot pause. A fragment of memory, a teaching from before their internment, when they had still been flesh and blood and capable of subtler thought. Know when to fight and when to think, for a warrior who can do only one is but half a soldier. The voice that had spoken those words was long gone, the face forgotten, but the wisdom remained. They needed to understand this situation before they acted. They needed information. They attempted communication again, this time using the Dreadnought's external speakers and trying to form words in Gothic. What emerged was a grinding mechanical approximation of speech, the words barely recognizable. Identify yourselves. Explain your presence in this sacred vault. By what authority have you disturbed my rest? The reaction from the Orks was not what the pilot expected. Instead of fear or confusion, there was excitement. Grotmasher's eyes lit up with something that might have been delight. He turned to his boys and shouted something that the pilot's linguistic processors managed to pass as, "It's talking! The Humi machine is talking!" Several of the Orks cheered. Sparkgit looked like he might actually explode with pride. Grotmasher stepped forward, lowering his massive weapon slightly, though not enough to be truly non-threatening. When he spoke, it was in that same corrupted Gothic, but slower this time, as if he was making an effort to be understood. "We's Orks, that's what we is. This here place were dead and buried, and we's found it. You was sleeping in your box there, and Sparkgit, he woke you up. That's what happened." The pilot processed this. Dead and buried. The fortress was gone then, not just damaged, but destroyed to the point where it was considered ruins. How long? How long had it been? They needed to know. They formed their next question carefully, fighting to make the words clear through the mechanical speakers. "What is the current date? What year is it by the Imperial calendar?" There was a pause. The Orks looked at each other, clearly confused by the question. Finally, one of the mech boys, probably Sparkgit, spoke up. "What's a calendar? Is that like a shooty thing?" The pilot felt something that might have been despair if they still had the biological capacity for such emotions. These Orks didn't know the date. They either didn't use or didn't understand the Imperial dating system, which meant that even if they told the pilot what year it was by their own reckoning, it would be meaningless. The pilot tried a different approach. "The Emperor. Does the Emperor still rule?" This question got a more animated response. Several Orks snorted or made dismissive gestures. Grotmasher shrugged, his massive shoulders making the motion look like a minor earthquake. "Don't know nothing 'bout no Emperor. We fight Yumis sometimes. They got all their fancy space marines and such. You one of them?" The pilot's consciousness reeled. They fought humans. These Orks fought the Imperium, fought space marines, which meant the Imperium still existed, or at least something that the Orks identified as the Imperium. But the way the war boss spoke of it suggested it was just another enemy, no more or less significant than any other faction the Orks might encounter. The religious reverence for the emperor that had characterized even secular imperial culture in the pilot's time was absent from this conversation. Something profound had changed. The pilot could feel it in the way these orcs spoke, in the unfamiliar patterns of their speech, in the fact that they could access this vault at all. They had been asleep for longer than they could comprehend. That much was clear. The question was, how much longer? They decided to try a more direct approach. They activated their targeting systems, not to attack, but to scan. The Dreadnought's sensors swept across the orcs, analyzing their weapons, their armor, their very biological signatures. What they found was disturbing. These orcs were different from the ones in the pilot's memory. Larger, more muscular, their biology showing signs of evolutionary refinement that spoke to countless generations of warfare. The weapons they carried, while crude, incorporated technologies that hadn't existed in the pilot's time. Plasma coils, magnetic accelerators, power fields, all cobbled together with typical Orky disregard for safety or efficiency, but undeniably advanced compared to what the pilot remembered. The biological data was even more telling. The pilot's knowledge of Ork genetics was limited, but they knew the basics. Orks evolved through conflict, each generation becoming more refined than the last when exposed to sufficient warfare. The degree of refinement they were seeing in these orcs suggested they had been fighting for a very, very long time. Thousands of years at minimum, possibly much longer. The pilot made a decision. They would cooperate, at least temporarily. They needed information, needed to understand what had happened to the galaxy, to the Imperium, to their chapter. And these orcs, unlikely as it seemed, might be their only source of that information. They disengaged their targeting systems, letting the weapons mounted on their chassis drop to a neutral position. I am ancient. They paused. What was their name? They could remember their rank, their function, but their name, the name they had borne as a flesh and blood, warrior, was gone. Lost to time or to the peculiar amnesia that afflicted all dreadnoughts eventually. I am ancient. I cannot recall my designation. One of the mech boys, not Sparkgit, but another, muttered something that sounded like, "That's not proper. A good stompy machine needs a good stompy name." Grotmasher silenced him with a gesture, his attention focused on the Dreadnought. The warboss's expression had shifted from excited to something more calculating. He was realizing, in his simple Orky way, that he had stumbled upon something significant. "Yous from before then," Grotmasher said, not quite a question. "From when things was different. Yous been sleeping a long time, I reckon." "Yes," the pilot acknowledged. There was no point in denying it. "A long time. I require information. I need to know what has transpired. I need to know the status of the Imperium, of the Space Marine chapters, of humanity's war against the alien and the heretic." Grotmasher laughed, a sound like boulders grinding together. "That's a lot of needing. Tell you what, Humie machine, you's got a problem and I's got a problem. You don't know what's going on, and I don't got enough stompy machines for the proper fight I's planning. Maybe we can work something out." The pilot's combat protocols screamed at this suggestion. Negotiate with Xenos? Work with Orks? It was heresy, blasphemy, a violation of every oath they had ever sworn. But those oaths had been sworn to a chapter that might not exist anymore, in service of an Imperium that had apparently changed beyond recognition. And more importantly, the pilot had nothing. No allies, no support, no purpose. They were a relic from a dead age, awake in a future they didn't understand. "What do you propose?" the pilot asked, the words tasting like ash even though they had no mouth to taste with. And so began one of the strangest negotiations in the history of the galaxy. On one side, an Ork warboss whose primary qualifications were being large, violent, and marginally more cunning than his peers. On the other, a consciousness that had once been human, now trapped in a walking tomb, trying to come to terms with the fact that everything they had known was gone. The conversation that followed was halting, punctuated by misunderstandings and near violence, but slowly a sort of understanding emerged. Grotmasher wanted to know about the vault. Were there more weapons, more technology, more stompy machines like the Dreadnought? The pilot, accessing what remained of the fortress's records through damaged data ports, confirmed that yes, there had been an armory here. Most of it was gone, looted or destroyed when the fortress fell, but some caches might remain, buried under rubble or sealed behind walls that had withstood the destruction. In exchange, the Orks would provide information. Where were they? What system? What sector? The Orks didn't know the formal designations, but they could describe the region, could tell the pilot about the other worlds they had visited, the enemies they had fought. From these descriptions, the pilot began to piece together their location. They were far from where the fortress had originally stood, the tectonic drift of 15 millennia having moved the continent, or perhaps the planet itself had been relocated, moved by forces or technologies the pilot couldn't imagine. And what of the Imperium? The Orks' knowledge was limited, but telling. They knew of the Imperium as a sprawling, bureaucratic nightmare of a civilization, controlled by priests and bureaucrats who worshipped a corpse god. They knew of the Space Marines as elite warriors, fewer in number than the Orks believed they had once been, divided into chapters that fought both together and against each other, depending on mysterious human politics that the Orks couldn't be bothered to understand. From these fragments, the pilot began to construct a picture of the galaxy they had awoken to. The Imperium survived, but it was not the Imperium they remembered. It had become theocratic, religious in a way that would have been unthinkable in their time. The Emperor, if these Orks were to be believed, was dead, or at least inactive, yet still worshipped. The Space Marine legions had apparently been broken up into smaller chapters, perhaps as a defensive measure against betrayal. But the most telling detail was one the Orks mentioned almost as an afterthought: chaos. The Orks spoke of Chaos Marines, of the corrupted forces that served the Dark Gods. The pilot's knowledge of chaos was limited, the details classified above their former rank, but they knew enough to understand the implication. There had been a betrayal, a fall to corruption so severe that it had split the Imperium's finest warriors. The pilot had gone to sleep in a galaxy where humanity fought only external enemies. They had awoken in one where humanity fought itself as much as it fought the alien. The weight of this realization was crushing. Everything they had believed in, every ideal they had fought for, had been corrupted or abandoned. The unity of purpose that had defined humanity's expansion into the stars had fractured into endless factional warfare. The rational, secular Imperium they remembered had become a superstitious theocracy that worshipped a corpse. And they, a relic of that earlier age, were now nothing more than a curiosity, a piece of ancient technology awakened in a future that had no place for them. Grotmasher seemed to sense the pilot's distress, though whether through genuine perception or just Orky instinct was unclear. "Look at it this way," the war boss said, his tone almost reassuring in its brutality. "You's got nothing left from before, right? That's sad and all, but it also means you's free. No boss is telling you what to do, no rules about what you can or can't fight. Use a stompy machine what can go where you want and crump who you want. That's pretty good, if you ask me." The pilot wanted to reject this philosophy, to cling to the oaths and duties that had defined their existence. But Grotmasher was right, in his own crude way. The pilot had been freed from their obligations by the simple fact that those obligations no longer existed. They were unbound, adrift, with no purpose except what they chose to give themselves. And what did they choose? The question hung in their consciousness, unanswerable for the moment. What does a weapon do when there is no one left to wield it? The conversation was interrupted by a shout from one of the Gretchen, who had been exploring the deeper parts of the vault. The little creature came scrambling back into the main chamber, chattering excitedly in the Orkish language. Grotmasher listened, his expression shifting from boredom to interest. He turned to the pilot. "Your little grot's found some fun. More machines, maybe. Want to come see?" The pilot considered. Every instinct screamed that this was a trap, that allowing themselves to be led deeper into unknown territory by Xenos was madness. But what choice did they have? They could attempt to fight their way out, could try to destroy all the Orks in this chamber, and escape to… where? The surface of a dead world, with no means of communication, no way to signal for help, no knowledge of where they were or how to get anywhere else. They accepted. Their Dreadnought chassis, ancient though it was, still functioned. The systems that had maintained them through 15,000 years of sleep did not fail now. They followed Grotmasher and his retinue deeper into the vault, their sensors sweeping constantly for threats, their weapons ready but not targeting. The Orks seemed relaxed, chatting among themselves about the find, about what they might be able to loot. What the Gretchen had found was another chamber, this one smaller than the stasis vault, but no less significant. It had been a workshop, a place where the fortress's tech marines had maintained and repaired the chapter's equipment. Most of the tools and machinery were gone, stripped by looters or destroyed in whatever cataclysm had brought down the fortress. But one item remained, protected by a stasis field similar to the one that had preserved the pilot's Dreadnought. It was a suit of Terminator armor, ancient beyond measure, of a pattern that the pilot didn't recognize. The armor stood in a maintenance cradle, sealed in its stasis field, perfectly preserved. The craftsmanship was exquisite, far superior to anything the pilot remembered from their time. This was artificer work, each plate perfectly shaped, each joint precisely calibrated. The armor bore no chapter markings, no indication of who had worn it or why it had been left here. Grotmasher looked at the armor, then at the Dreadnought, then back at the armor. "That's a big suit," he observed. "Probably worth a lot of teeth. What you think, ancient Humy machine? Dis something we should take?" The pilot examined the armor through their sensors. It was intact, functional, worth more than the entire Ork warband combined if sold to the right buyer. It was also sacred, a relic of their chapter, or perhaps another chapter that had sought shelter here. To allow the Orks to take it, to loot and desecrate it, would be a betrayal of everything the pilot had been. But then again, what did that matter? The chapter was gone. The warriors who had worn this armor were dust. Letting it remain here, sealed in stasis for another 15,000 years while the galaxy burned around it, served no purpose. Perhaps it was better to let the Orks take it, to let it see use again, even in corrupted form. At least then it would serve some function, however debased. "Take it," the pilot said, the words feeling like a surrender. "It serves no purpose here." The mech boys set to work immediately, shutting down the stasis field and extracting the armor from its cradle. Sparkgit was already planning modifications, talking excitedly about how much better it would look with more spikes and maybe some red paint. The pilot watched this desecration in silence, feeling nothing. Or perhaps feeling too much, emotions so complex and contradictory that they cancelled each other out into a sort of grey numbness. They continued exploring the vault, finding more caches of equipment, more weapons, more ammunition. Everything was looted, loaded onto the Orks' crude transports with no ceremony or reverence. The pilot helped, using their Dreadnought's strength to shift heavy objects, to break through walls when the Orks couldn't. They told themselves they were buying information, making a strategic alliance. But really, they were just going through the motions, filling the void where purpose used to be with action, any action, to avoid confronting the emptiness. As the sun set on the ruined world, the Orks had stripped the vault of everything valuable. The last transport was loaded, the final piece of sacred technology reduced to loot. Grotmasher approached the pilot one final time. "That's all of it, I reckon. Good haul. You's been useful, ancient Humy machine. Got a proposition for you." The pilot waited. "We's heading to the next fight. Big scrap, lots of crumping. Could use a proper stompy machine like you. You come with us, keep fighting. Maybe you find out more about what happened to your Yumis. Or maybe you just get to crump some gits what need crumping. Either way, better than staying here on this dead rock, innit?" The pilot considered this offer. Go with the Orks, fight alongside Xenos, betray every oath they had ever sworn, or stay here, alone on a dead world, waiting for a rescue that would never come, serving a chapter that no longer existed. When put in those terms, the choice was obvious. "I will accompany you," the pilot said, "but I fight for my own reasons, not for your wag." Grotmasha grinned, showing teeth like tombstones. "Suits me fine. Long as you shoot in the same direction as us, I don't care why you's doing." And so the ancient Dreadnought, relic of an age long dead, left the ruins of the fortress that had been their tomb for 15,000 years. They boarded the Ork transport, their massive frame barely fitting through the crude loading ramp, and found a space among the looted weapons and scrap metal. As the transport lifted off, they looked back at the ruined fortress one last time, at the grave of their chapter and their past. They felt nothing, no grief, no anger, no loss, just the cold certainty that came with having outlived everything they had ever cared about. They were a weapon now, nothing more, a tool to be used until it broke. And in the grim darkness of the far future, that was perhaps the kindest fate available. The implications of this encounter ripple far beyond the immediate participants. The Orks had gained not just loot, but knowledge. The mech boys who had examined the Dreadnought, who had seen its internal mechanisms and studied its operation, would carry that knowledge with them. It would inform their future creations, would subtly influence the design of death dreads and killer cans they built. The sophistication of a 15,000-year-old Dreadnought, even imperfectly understood, would make their war machines marginally more effective, marginally more dangerous. And the pilot? They had lost everything, but gained something as well, knowledge of the present. They understood now what the galaxy had become, understood the factions that fought for control, understood that the Imperium they remembered was gone, replaced by something simultaneously familiar and alien. This knowledge would inform their choices, would guide their actions in the battles to come. But perhaps most significantly, this encounter represents something that happens countless times across the galaxy, though rarely with participants quite so ancient. It is the meeting of past and future, of forgotten knowledge and brutal pragmatism. It is a reminder that in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, nothing stays buried forever. The past always returns, though never in the form we expect, and never with the answers we hope for. The Ork warband, now reinforced by an ancient Dreadnought and laden with looted weapons, departed the dead world and set course for their next target. Where they were going, what battles awaited them, even they didn't fully know. Such is the nature of the Wah, a force that moves according to instincts deeper than conscious thought, drawn toward conflict like a moth to flame. The pilot went with them, not out of allegiance or belief, but simply because there was nowhere else to go. In the cargo hold of an Ork transport, surrounded by crude machinery and brutal warriors, an ancient hero of humanity traveled toward an unknown future, carrying with them the memories of a time when things were different, when there was still hope, when the future seemed bright instead of merely endless. Whether this is tragedy or farce is left for the observer to decide. In a galaxy where there is only war, where the laughter of thirsting gods echoes through the void and hope is a luxury few can afford, perhaps the distinction doesn't matter. What matters is that the war continues, that the cycle of violence perpetuates, that ancient warriors and brutal Xenos alike continue their dance of death across the stars. And somewhere in the depths of that ancient Dreadnought's consciousness, buried beneath layers of tactical data and combat protocols, a small voice whispers a question that will never be answered. Was it worth it? Any of it? But there is no one left to hear, and no answer that would satisfy. There is only the next battle, and the one after that, and the one after that, stretching forward into an infinite future where everything changes and nothing gets better. This is the grim darkness of the far future, where even the dead can find no peace. The story of this encounter would spread, though like all stories in the 41st millennium, it would be distorted in the telling. The Orks would boast of the ancient stompy machine they found and made work again, embellishing the tale until it bore little resemblance to reality. The Imperium, if it ever learned of the Dreadnought's awakening, would classify the information and send investigators to determine which chapter had lost one of their ancients. Those investigators would find only ruins and more questions. And the pilot? They would fight in battles whose names they would forget, against enemies whose purposes meant nothing to them, in a war that had long since lost any meaning beyond its own perpetuation. They would become a legend among the Orks, the ancient Hume machine that fought like a proper Ork, and a nightmare to Imperial forces who encountered them. A Dreadnought that fought alongside Xenos and seemed to answer to no chapter or code. But inside the sarcophagus, in the silence between battles, the consciousness that had once been human would still ask itself the same questions. Who am I? What was I fighting for? Does any of this matter? And like all Dreadnoughts who live long enough, they would learn that these questions have no answers. Only the endless war and the vain hope that maybe, just maybe, the next battle will be the one that finally makes sense of it all. It never is. This, then, is what happens when Orks find a Dreadnought that has been asleep for 15,000 years. Not the simple story of technology being looted or warriors awakening to fight again, but something more complex and more tragic. It is the collision of past and future, of purpose and pragmatism, of everything that was and everything that is. It is a reminder that in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, there are fates worse than death, and being forgotten is not even the worst of them. The worst fate is to remember. To carry with you the knowledge of what was lost, what could have been, what should have been, and to live on anyway, serving, no purpose beyond survival, fighting no battles that matter, making no difference in a galaxy too vast and too broken to be saved. This is the curse of the Dreadnought, magnified 1,000-fold by the passage of ages. It's the curse of being a living link to a dead past, of bearing witness to the slow decay of everything you once believed in. Consider what the pilot experienced in those hours after awakening. They went from being a hero of the Imperium, a warrior sworn to protect humanity, to being a curiosity at best and salvage at worst. They discovered that the galaxy they knew was gone, replaced by one that was simultaneously familiar and alien. They found that the very language had evolved to the point where they could barely understand it. They learned that their chapter, if it still existed at all, had moved on without them so completely that they might as well have never existed. And perhaps most devastatingly, they discovered that none of it mattered. The wars they had fought, the victories they had won, the sacrifices they had made, all of it had been washed away by the tide of history. The enemies they had defeated had been replaced by new enemies. The worlds they had saved had fallen to different threats or simply been forgotten. The Imperium they had served had become something they would barely recognize, and quite possibly something they would be horrified by. This is the existential horror at the heart of the Warhammer 40,000 setting. It's not just that the galaxy is a dark and terrible place. It's that the darkness is eternal and unchanging. Individual heroes can make individual differences, can save individual lives or worlds, but the overall trajectory of the galaxy never changes. The wars continue forever. The darkness never lifts. Hope is not deferred, but actively crushed, repeatedly, systematically, across millennia. The pilot's journey from honored ancient to Ork companion is a perfect microcosm of this larger truth. They started as something meaningful, a warrior who mattered, whose service had purpose. They ended as something reduced, a weapon without a wielder, a relic without context, a consciousness trapped in a machine that has outlived everything that gave it meaning. The transition wasn't caused by any single catastrophe or betrayal, but simply by time, that most inexorable of enemies. And yet, there's a strange freedom in that reduction. Grotmasher was right when he pointed out that the pilot had no obligations left. Without chapter, without brothers, without even a clear understanding of what the Imperium had become. The pilot was unbound from all the oaths and duties that had defined their existence. They were free to choose their own path, to fight for their own reasons, to define their own purpose. Of course, that freedom is also a burden. It's easy to have purpose when someone else defines it for you, when your role in the great machine of war is clear and unambiguous. It's much harder when you have to decide for yourself what matters, what's worth fighting for, what makes existence meaningful. The pilot had spent their entire life, both before and after internment in the Dreadnought, following orders, executing missions, serving a cause larger than themselves. Now they had to figure out how to exist without that structure. The decision to accompany the Orks was, in a sense, an avoidance of that question. By signing on for the next fight, the pilot was choosing familiar action over uncomfortable reflection. They were defaulting to what they knew: combat, violence, the mechanics of warfare, rather than confronting the deeper questions about purpose and meaning. It's an understandable choice, even a relatable one, but it's also fundamentally a retreat from the harder work of building a new identity from the ruins of the old. This pattern repeats throughout the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Warriors who have lost everything they fought for don't stop fighting. They just find new enemies, new battles, new reasons to perpetuate the cycle of violence. The alternative, stopping, reflecting, trying to build something other than mountains of corpses, is presented as impossible, naive, a betrayal of duty. The galaxy has become so committed to the perpetuation of war that it can't imagine any other mode of existence. The Orks, meanwhile, represent a different relationship with violence. For them, war isn't a tragedy or a necessity. It's simply what they are, what they do, what they exist for. There's no angst about it, no questioning whether it serves a larger purpose. They fight because fighting is fun, because it's what Orks do, because the alternative would be boring. In a twisted way, this makes them more honest than the Imperium's warriors, who dress up their endless warfare in the language of duty and honor and sacrifice. When the pilot chose to fight alongside the Orks, they were in some sense admitting this truth. Stripped of all the pomp and ceremony, all the sacred oaths and holy purpose, war is just war. Violence is just violence. A warrior who has forgotten why they're fighting is functionally no different from an Ork who never questioned it in the first place. Both are just pulling triggers and swinging weapons, participating in a cycle of destruction that serves no purpose beyond its own continuation. But there's a crucial difference that the pilot would do well to remember. The Orks embrace this nihilism, find joy in it even. They've built an entire culture around the celebration of violence for its own sake. The pilot, on the other hand, carries the weight of knowing that it could be different, should be different, that there was once, or they believe there was once, a galaxy where war served a purpose beyond itself. That knowledge is both a curse and a potential path to something better. The tragedy is that in the 41st millennium, that knowledge is effectively useless. The galaxy is too far gone, too committed to its own destruction, too saturated with forces that feed on conflict and suffering. An individual warrior, even one with 15,000 years of experience, cannot change the fundamental trajectory of the galaxy. The best they can hope for is to make small differences, to protect a few lives, to hold back the darkness from a few more planets, to maybe inspire a few other warriors to remember that there's supposed to be more to existence than endless war. Will the pilot do any of this? The story leaves that question open. They've made the choice to continue fighting, to accompany the Orks to their next battle. What happens after that? Whether they find new purpose, or simply fade into the same mechanical existence that claims all dreadnoughts eventually, remains to be seen. But the pattern suggests that the latter is more likely. Without connection to something larger than themselves, without bonds to other beings who can remind them of their humanity, the pilot will almost certainly undergo the same erosion of identity that affects all isolated dreadnoughts. And in a century or 2 or 10, they'll be indistinguishable from the orcs around them, a thing that fights because fighting is what it does, that kills because killing is its function, that exists only in the moment of violence, without past or future or purpose. The tragedy won't be complete until that transformation is finished, until the last memory of what they once were has been overwritten by tactical data and combat protocols. This is what makes the encounter between orcs and ancient dreadnought so symbolically powerful. It's not just about the specific characters involved, but about what they represent. The orcs represent the galaxy's descent into barbarism, its embrace of violence as an end in itself. The dreadnought represents the slow erosion of everything that made humanity human, the reduction of even the noblest warriors to mere weapons. And their partnership represents the final victory of that darkness, the moment when even the heroes of the past become indistinguishable from the barbarism of the present. Yet there's also something darkly appropriate about it. The pilot spent their entire existence fighting to preserve an Imperium that, if the orcs' descriptions are accurate, became exactly the kind of oppressive theocracy they might have fought against in their original time. The ideals they sacrificed for were corrupted or abandoned. The victories they won led only to new wars. In that context, fighting alongside orcs is just being honest about what warfare in the 41st millennium actually is. Purposeless violence perpetuated for its own sake, dressed up in the language of duty and honor, but ultimately signifying nothing. The Warhammer 40,000 setting has always been about this kind of cosmic futility. Its tagline, "In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war," isn't just describing a state of affairs, but a metaphysical truth. The galaxy has become locked in a pattern where war perpetuates itself, where every victory seeds future defeats, where even the greatest heroes only delay the inevitable rather than preventing it. The pilot's story is just one more variation on this theme, distinguished only by the temporal scale involved. And that scale is important. 15,000 years is an almost incomprehensible span of time for human consciousness to grasp. It's longer than all of recorded human history. It's longer than the existence of agriculture, of cities, of anything we would recognize as civilization. For a single consciousness to span that much time, to remain aware across such an abyss of years, is to experience a kind of temporal trauma that no biology or psychology was designed to handle. The pilot's disconnection from reality is not just emotional, but fundamental. They have no frame of reference for understanding the present. Every assumption they make is based on information that's at least 15,000 years out of date. Every instinct they have was honed in a different age. They are a being out of time in the most literal sense, and there's no path back to synchronicity with the present. They can learn the facts of the current era, can accumulate new knowledge, but they'll always be operating from a foundation that no longer exists. This creates a kind of double alienation. They're alienated from the present because it's so different from what they knew, but they're also alienated from the past because they're the only one who remembers it as it actually was. To everyone else, the Age of Strife is myth and legend, its details lost or distorted by the passage of millennia. But to the pilot, it's lived experience, memory, the context in which they were created and first fought. They carry a truth that no one else can verify or even fully understand. In the end, what happens when orcs find a dreadnought that's been asleep for 15,000 years is this: reality happens. The comforting myths about honor and duty and eternal service are stripped away, revealing the brutal truth underneath. A warrior becomes a weapon. A sacred tomb becomes salvage. A hero becomes a curiosity. And the galaxy moves on, uncaring, its endless wars consuming both the ancient and the new with the same indifferent hunger. It's a story without heroes or villains, without triumph or tragedy in the traditional sense. It's simply a story about the nature of existence in a universe that has abandoned meaning for mere persistence, where the only constant is violence and the only victory is surviving to fight another day. The pilot will fight their next battle, and the one after that, and the one after that. And at some point, the battles will blur together until they can't remember which war they're fighting or why it started. And that will be the final defeat, not death, but the loss of even the capacity to question whether any of it matters. This is the grim darkness of the far future. Not the darkness of evil triumphant, but the darkness of meaninglessness, of existence reduced to its barest mechanical components, of consciousness persisting long after everything that made it conscious has been stripped away. It's the darkness of a galaxy where even hope has become just another resource to be consumed by the eternal war machine. And in that darkness, a 15,000-year-old warrior fights alongside orcs, having discovered that in the end, it makes no difference who you fight for or why. The only question that matters is whether you're still fighting when the darkness finally claims you. Everything else, honor, duty, purpose, meaning, is just noise, soon to be drowned out by the thunder of guns and the screams of the dying. This is not a happy story. But then, in the 41st millennium, there are no happy stories. There are only degrees of tragedy, and the pilot's tragedy is that they survived long enough to learn this truth. This is the curse of the Dreadnought, magnified 1,000-fold by the passage of ages. And this is what awaits all those who believe that duty is eternal, that service never ends, that the warrior's path leads anywhere but the grave. Eventually, time catches up with everyone, even those who thought they had escaped it by accepting immortality in a walking tomb. The galaxy turns, the wars continue, and somewhere out there, an ancient dreadnought fights alongside orcs, wondering if there was ever a point to any of it. The answer, if there is one, lies not in victory or defeat, not in glory or shame, but in the simple acceptance that in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and all we can do is choose how we face it. For the pilot of that ancient dreadnought, they chose to face it by doing what they had always done, fighting. Not for the Emperor, not for the Imperium, not even for themselves, but simply because fighting was all they knew, all they had ever known, all they would ever know until the day some enemy finally breached their sarcophagus and gave them the peace of true death. And in the end, perhaps that is all any warrior can hope for in the 41st millennium, to die fighting, to fall in battle rather than fade away, to go down swinging rather than rust away in some forgotten vault. If that is the only victory available, if that is the only meaning left to extract from an existence that has outlasted everything else, then perhaps it is enough. Or perhaps it isn't. Perhaps nothing is enough. Perhaps no meaning can be found. Perhaps the whole exercise is as futile and pointless as everything else in a galaxy that has long since abandoned hope for desperation, and desperation for mere persistence. But the war continues regardless. The orcs fight because it's what orcs do. The Imperium fights because it must. And the ancient dreadnought fights because there is nothing else left. Three forces, utterly different in nature and purpose, united only in their commitment to endless violence, participating in a conflict that has no winners, no end, and no point beyond its own continuation. This is the truth at the heart of Warhammer 40,000, the reality that makes it both compelling and horrifying. There is no hope. There is no salvation. There is no escape. There is only war, eternal and unchanging, grinding through souls and civilizations with the same indifferent inevitability as entropy itself. And somewhere in all that darkness, an ancient warrior who has seen the rise and fall of ages, who has witnessed the death of everything they loved and the corruption of everything they believed in, continues to fight, not because they have hope, but because they have nothing else. They are a monument to the futility of existence in the 41st millennium, a warning to all who believe that service and duty and honor mean anything beyond the moment of their expression. They are, in short, the perfect symbol of their universe, tragic, powerful, and ultimately meaningless. If you found this exploration of what happens when orcs find an ancient dreadnought as fascinating as we did creating it, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We dive deep into the lore of Warhammer 40,000 every week, exploring the stories, the characters, and the terrible beauty of a galaxy where there is only war. The encounter we've explored today represents just one of countless similar meetings happening across the galaxy. Every day, somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, ancient things are awakened, old wars are reignited, and the past collides with the present in ways both tragic and terrifying. The Dreadnought and the Orks are just two participants in a drama that spans the entire galaxy and has been playing out for tens of thousands of years. What makes this particular story resonate is how perfectly it encapsulates the fundamental tragedy of the Warhammer 40,000 setting. Here is a warrior who has given literally everything in service of an ideal, only to discover that the ideal is gone and the service was meaningless. And yet they continue, because continuing is all they know how to do. It's a metaphor for the entire Imperium, for the entire galaxy, institutions and individuals perpetuating behaviors and beliefs that no longer serve any purpose, simply because the alternative would be to confront the void of meaninglessness at the heart of their existence. Until next time, remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, even sleep offers no escape, and the only peace is the peace of death itself. But even death, in a galaxy where the dead can be awakened after 15,000 years, is no guarantee of rest. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next deep dive into the lore of the 41st millennium.